Well, I want to speak now to the President of Georgia, Salome Zorovishvili. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. First of all, could I just get your reaction to what's happened in Slovakia?
Well, it's violence of that kind is always a tragedy, and it's especially a tragedy for a democracy. For the rest, I don't know what is the background, what is the reason for that, whether it's political or whether it's criminal, so I cannot comment more than that. But the tragedy it is.
And is it too early to say, but does this say anything about politics and polarisation and the threat that politicians face?
I think that we're living in a world where the polarisation is getting everywhere. Very tense, and that has to do with social networks where people are just giving way to their inner hate speech and everything, and that's very dangerous. So yes, we are in that type of politics all over around the world, and it's something that should be controlled as much as possible.
President, I want to turn now to what's been happening in your country. I'm just going to remind viewers, I'm going to get the latest after politicians, of course, passed a law that critics say will clamp down on free speech. And today, the UK, the US, EU, UN, NATO all condemned this law. The law brands organisations with some overseas funding as foreign agents. Similar law has been passed in Russia. Yesterday, after the vote, protesters clashed with police. And just a reminder of the background, Georgia emerged from the collapsing Soviet Union as an independent state in 1991. In 2008, Russian troops invaded the border areas in Georgia, supporting separatists and retaining direct control over the breakaway areas. Many in Georgia want to join the EU, of course, and that's seen as a source of concern for neighbouring Russia. Now, the EU has said that adopting the law would negatively impact the country's chance of becoming a member. At a meeting earlier today, the Baltic states went further, saying the law will, quote, close the door on membership. Take a listen.
The adoption of the Foreign Agents Law, as well as continued repression against Georgia's civil society, will stop Georgia's further progress on EU and NATO path. If this happens, responsibility will lie squarely on Georgia's government. However, it is still not too late. We have heard from the Madam President that she plans to veto the law, and this will offer a way out opportunity for the government.
Well, President, you were referred to there. First of all, before we get on to the issue of the veto, what was your reaction when MPs passed the law?
Well, my reaction was not one of deception, disillusion, because since this law has been introduced last year and rejected with the same conjunction of foreign European and American protests, and especially mass protests in Georgia, and the authorities withdrew the law, promising that never again. So the introduction a second time, to me, it was clear that this time they were going to push that law through the throat of the Georgian people, because otherwise you do not introduce for a second time something that you know is rejected by both your population and your closest partners.
Okay.
So it was very strange at the same time, but that's where we are. They are pushing down the throat, and they now are faced with this uproar of the Georgian population and the uproar of our closest partners and friends.
You've said you will veto it. When will you do that?
I have 2 weeks to veto that law, and most probably they are going to override the veto unless they now are going to again withdraw under the combined pressure of the people on the streets and our friends and partners. In that case, they can simply let the veto be, and that will be very easy, or they can simply themselves block the law and decide and announce that they will consider a different type of law that they would discuss with partners, or simply again just throw it back after the elections. We have elections in 5 months now, on the 26th of October. And so the Georgian population will decide whether they want Europe with its values and laws and legislations, or whether they want to turn their back on Europe and its values and legislations and go down that road which is unknown.
And if this law is passed, do you think there is any way to EU membership?
Well, I think that any decision concerning Georgia as a nation cannot be taken before the elections, because that's where, in any democracy, that's the way it works. That's where the Georgian population, the Georgian nation, will say whether it wants, as it has been shown all these years, Europe and continue down the path of the European integration, or whether they accommodate themselves with this new mixture. So I think that elections will be determining, and that for the time being, we have this protest. They're probably going to continue over some time of the summer, and then we'll have the electoral campaign. So let's leave the decision on the Georgian future to the Georgian people to whom it belongs.
OK, the Prime Minister is saying that this is necessary for sovereignty in Georgia. Let's just take a very quick listen to some of what he said.
Today is the most important day in terms of strengthening the independence and sovereignty of our country. The adoption of the law on transparency of foreign influence creates strong guarantees of long-term peace and tranquility in Georgia, and to overcome so-called polarization, which is a necessary condition for Georgia's integration into the European Union.
So, President, what about that argument that this is necessary for sovereignty?
Well, that's language that you have heard from some other countries, and very similar to the language that Russian propaganda is pushing through on some countries. This has been very well received. All these speeches have very well been received by Moscow and by some of the spokesmen for the Moscow leadership. But nonetheless, this law, despite what is said by the Prime Minister, does not decrease polarization. It has recreated polarization. In fact, never was Georgia so little polarized than since the candidate status was granted to Georgia last December. There was an enthusiasm, a consensus of the whole population. Then we had the Georgian soccer team that entered the competition for the Euro 2024 for the first time. And again, there was a huge consensus, huge enthusiasm on the streets of Georgia. So it was a less polarized environment that one could think about. And at that time, they're throwing in this law, which provokes the type of polarization that we see on the streets. Also, I think that there is a very vast majority of the people that support that. So it's not a divided country, but it's a polarized country between the government and the authorities and the ruling party and circles and the rest of the population that doesn't want to lose the European chance.
And what about the influence of Russia? Are you worried?
Well, when you're a neighbor to Russia, especially today's Russia and the way it behaves in Ukraine, you cannot not be worried. That would not be very reasonable. But that doesn't mean that what is determining our foreign policy. I must remind you that Georgia has been aggressed and invaded by Russia, that 20% of our territories are occupied by Russia, and that despite that, Georgia has not changed an inch of its European orientation and of its Atlantic orientation. That says a lot about the determination for its people, because we see that as the only guarantee to our independence in the end.
OK. President Zurabishvili, thank you very much for coming on the programme. Thank you.
Thank you.